Welcome and thanks for joining us tonight for this public event from the Psychedelic Experience Clinic. Just so you know, tonight will be recorded, so it's preferable if you remain muted. Afterwards, after the presentation, there will be time for questions and a bit of discussion, so we can look forward to that too. We're pleased to be joined tonight by Nick Totton for his talk, Journey from Psychedelics to Embodiment and Wildness. Nick is a body psychotherapist, supervisor and trainer with over 40 years of practice. He has created 2 trainings, one in Embodied Relational Therapy and one in Wild Therapy. And he has published more than a dozen books, including the 2 that led me to ask him to speak for us. One evening, I suddenly realized that the author of Wild Therapy was the same person who had edited the collection of essays called Psychoanalysis and the Paranormal. I thought, with interests like this, there's no way this person isn't also into psychedelics. So I sent Nick an email, and it turns out I was right. This talk is about the relationship between psychedelics and his career as a psychotherapist. Thank you very much for speaking to us, Nick.
Thank you for asking me.
It's a pleasure to have you. Whenever you're ready.
So, I've got very little idea what I'm going to say, but I have a feeling it will work out. I know where I want to start. I want to start with the old saying you may have heard, that if you can remember the 60s, you weren't there. My period is the 70s, but I think the same sort of thing applies. I do remember, but I could not possibly put events into a sequential order. Or go into too much detail. It's more the feeling of the whole thing that I remember than the detail. But it was a very different time in a lot of ways, and it was a very different way of relating to and using psychedelics, I think. And that's part of what I want to talk about. I came into, there's a sequence really. After university, which I left in about 1970, I was into political activism. And there's a kind of sequence of moving from activism to the psychedelics and to psychotherapy and to ecopsychology. It's not like one of those followed. It's not like they followed each other in a straight sequence, but they're all going at the same time and all moving in the same direction. In retrospect, that appears to be the case anyway. So the psychedelics that I used basically started with it started with cannabis, which I do count as a psychedelic, especially the kinds of cannabis that we had access to, things like Buddha grass and Thai sticks, which actually were like a mini trip that kind of took you up and then it brought you back down again in just a couple of hours. So that was the starting place, and the next thing to come along was acid, which we could get in very, very pure form. It was coming from, you know, the great American producers of acid, the people around the Grateful Dead and those kinds of bands. We had we were mainly using window pane, which was called window pane because it came in little transparent cellophane rectangles, which looked basically like window pane. And then a bit later, psilocybin came along, liberty caps, acid that you could just find in the grass and pick up and eat, which was quite an unexpected experience at the time because it was very new. There was no live tradition in this country of using mushrooms as psychedelics. I'm sure that there was once a tradition of it, but it was a completely fresh discovery. but the way in which we used psychedelics was very different. We used them in the wild, so to speak. We used them in beautiful places. We used them in woods and by rivers and in gardens, and we used them with other people. So it was a profoundly relational experience and a profoundly wild experience. And also, and this is one of the ways in which it followed on from my activism, it was a transgressive experience. The idea that psychedelics might be good for society as well as good for individuals was completely foreign to us, and it's still, to be honest, completely foreign to me. It seems to me to be trying to square the circle to argue that psychedelics are something which the capitalist of society ought to welcome, ought to find a place for. And it's very much not the way that any of us saw them at that time. We saw them pretty much as a revolutionary tool, if you like, as a way of challenging the existing order. So although my own entry was after the heady days of the late 60s, we still actually believed at that point that there could be a hippie revolution, which now sounds somewhat ludicrous, but absolutely wasn't ludicrous at the time. And a part of the reason it wasn't ludicrous was because of the psychedelics we were taking. Not in the sense that, okay, that made us slightly unhinged and unable to recognize reality, but in the sense that it gave us a very broad and deep perception of the world and of what was wrong with the human world at the time. And it gave us a very convincing sense of the reality of our own experience, which I still don't believe was an illusion. I find that a lot of veterans of that period really don't want to talk about it, feel a bit embarrassed by it, and want to actually ridicule their own experience, which I think is very sad, but also very understandable, because we lost a war. We really did lose a war. It was a war without mass victims, but people did die. And people were damaged, and people were deeply wounded psychologically, sometimes by the psychedelics, but more often by the hostile reactions of the state, of the establishment. And when you've lost a war, you know, it leaves a trauma. It leaves a deep trauma, and I feel that in myself still, and I feel it's led a lot of other people to just simply want to wipe out that experience, or as I say, ridicule it. And there were funny and silly things about it for sure. A great deal of silliness. But hey, what's wrong with silliness? So we were using psychedelics in all sorts of ways. Sometimes almost recreationally, not in the way that people now use drugs like acid recreationally, but you know, sometimes it was just too boring not to take them. And that's, in retrospect, that doesn't feel like the ideal way to do it, but much more often we were taking them really seriously. We were setting up the situation to maximize our chances of a profound experience. You using music, using the other than human environment, and using each other as I say, it was a very, very relational business. When I hear about the common current model, it's not universal, I know, but it's very common that people take psychedelics lying on a mattress in a room full of other people lying on mattresses. That strikes me as quite bizarre, because it's an intrapersonal experience rather than an interpersonal experience. And that's the importance of that interpersonal experience. The importance of the relationship is something which I followed through into the way that I practice and teach psychotherapy. It's very central to my understanding of what psychotherapy is and what it can do and how it works. And that very much comes out of my experience with acid and mushrooms. Not that we wouldn't sometimes trip on our own, but it was a collective endeavor, a way of researching the nature of the universe, the nature of human consciousness, the nature of human relationships, which sounds grandiose, but and it was grandiose, but it was also huge. It was also so profoundly real. Lost my thread for a second. Yeah, before I started using drugs, I was extremely physically rigid, extremely tight, extremely anxious. I remember my first few experiences with my first few experiences with cannabis. I was actually physically terrified of the relaxation that it was inducing in my body. And that's something that is a constant aspect of working as a body psychotherapist. It's a different way of inducing that same relaxation of tension, which allows new feelings, new thoughts, new experiences to emerge. It was in 1980 that I did my first Reichian body psychotherapy workshop. I went on my first workshop, and I emerged from the first session there actually shouting, "Who needs acid?" Because the depth of the experience, the depth of release that emerged from following my breath, deepening my breath, and allowing the effects of that on my body were as big as the effects of acid and mushrooms. However, I think that was partly made possible for me by the fact that I'd already been involved with acid and mushrooms. So on the one hand, it led me into body psychotherapy. It felt like a very natural way to go. There wasn't the same kind of culture of breath work back then as there is now. In fact, the writing work that I discovered was a real niche thing, and it was pure chance that I found my way to it. It was there was only one person, I think, who was actually running workshops like that, and I just happened to be in a kitchen with a flyer for a workshop on the wall. But I've been following Reich for many years as a sort of a signpost, a guiding feature in the landscape, because I kept coming across him. I came across him when I was a student in '68, because he was a constant reference point for libertarian politics. I came across him again a few years after that in relation to, well, when I was using drugs, I came across his work with the weather. You have probably had experiences of looking at the sky on psychedelics and thinking this is not what the sky's. This is not what we were told the sky was. It's a great deal more interesting and exciting and strange than we thought. And having had those experiences, I realized that Reich actually had worked in that area for quite a long time as well. So I kept coming across him, but it had never really occurred to me that people would do Reich in therapy. I thought of that as something, back in the past or in some other universe. I knew about him as a sort of as a guru figure from the 60s. So when I actually realized that it was possible to experience Reichian therapy in a workshop situation, and then from that to actually train as a Reichian therapist and work with individuals with it, that was a huge thing for me. But the other biggest thing I think that psychedelics opened up for me was my relationship with the other than human world. I don't talk about nature because I think it's a really misleading term, a really confusing term, because it implies that we in some strange way are not part of nature. So we talk about nature as something that we kind of venture forth into, without really acknowledging that our life in cities or anywhere else is an expression of nature just as much as the wildest mountain or valley or ocean. We are a part of nature. We are an expression of natural forces. So what it led me into a connection with was the other than human, and a very powerful experience it was too. I remember, just as a small example, I remember suddenly realizing that for many years I've been picking flowers without actually relating to them as living creatures. I felt terrible about it. I started thanking flowers if I picked them. I started noticing actually what was around me, noticing the detail of it and the grand sweep of it. I remember sitting in a bit of woodland, high on mushrooms, and having squirrels come and run over me. Because my relationship with the place where I was so completely different from how it had been before that. So that led me to wild therapy, to exploring, doing therapy in and through and with wildness, by which I don't mean, some exotic jungle on the other side of the planet. I mean finding a piece of wildness near at hand, of which there are always possibilities. There's always specimens of that. And just realizing, like, people often say every piece of woodland is actually part of the great wood. And it really is like that, I think. You can get lost in a tiny little piece of woodland. You can go into it expecting to emerge on the other side in 5 minutes, and then you can get lost. Suddenly you can't find your way out because it's a real wood. And those are the kind of places I like to do wild therapy. And again, it's a relational experience because you're not on your own as a therapist. You've got a co-therapist who's much bigger than you, much bigger than you. You've got the more than human and other than human as your partners. So actually, it lifts, in my experience, it lifts the burden of transference in a quite unexpected way. Suddenly, the client is not putting the, the, those relational burdens on you. They're putting them elsewhere, on trees, on plants, on living creatures, on stones. It's a very humbling experience and a very liberating experience, a very psychedelic experience, something which I'm as interested in taking back into the therapy room as I am in exploring in the wild. The wild therapy training which I started turned out not to be a training in working with other people in the wild. It turned out to be an immersive experience of relating to wildness, which actually frees people up to be a different kind of therapist in any environment. You start to question what parts of the therapeutic frame are actually required, and what parts are just old habits and instructions. Because trying to carry the entire therapeutic frame into the wild is pretty difficult. It's about as difficult as strapping an iron bed frame on your back and heading off into the wild. It simply doesn't work. So things fall away, and then you think, do I need those in the therapy room? When you're out in the woods with somebody, you're side by side, literally and metaphorically. There'll be some things that the client can do better than you. There'll be some things that they know more about than you do. There'll be times when they're helping you over a stile, or times when you fall on your bum in the mud and they help you get up again. It's equalizing in very profound and, in some ways, scary ways. And we can explore the implications of that as we go on, because I'm starting to run down, I think, in terms of what I have to say spontaneously. I'd much rather do the rest of it as a conversation, if that's okay with people. So I'm going to pause and find out what you want to say and want to ask and want to argue with.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I've got some initial thoughts, and anybody jump in wherever. I guess starting from where you stopped, actually, with this idea of the burden of the transference, because there's some people who, of course, will, and I want to put this forward about the frame as well, will say that these two elements of the psychoanalytic setup are sort of co-emergent, so that the frame produces the transference, and because you've got transference, you need a frame to contain it. And the 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 energies, let's say, that are brought up in a transference relationship, can be the engine of the treatment because they're boundaried by the frame. But in the way that you're talking about it and what you're putting forward, it seems like you've got a different conception of how the treatment moves forward, and perhaps that the frame might be constraining.
Well, I think, yes, I think in many ways it is, yeah. Sure. And I've got a theoretical response and a practical response, and the practical response is more important. No, that turns out not to be the case, what you're saying. Experience has shown me that it is not the case, that the frame in the classic form is required. It seemed a reasonable idea, but it turns out not to be true. As for the transference, it doesn't go away; it just gets put somewhere else. But it's interesting because it tends to be more positive transference. I really like Lacan's early idea, actually, that it's countertransference which produces the transference. In other words, that the therapist's misunderstandings of the client are what produces the so-called transference, which is actually saying you're just like everybody else in my life who's misunderstood me, and it's true. I think that's actually one of Lacan's more radical formulations, and I find it extremely useful. But the striking thing that comes up in wild therapy is people's experience of radical acceptance from the other, not from the human other, but from the other than human. I've had people saying so many times, I have never felt the acceptance that I felt from that tree. It's clearly a very real and profound event. I felt it myself, of course. And I think it sets us as therapists the challenge. Can I be as accepting as that tree? Am I capable of that? Am I capable of actually rivaling that tree's ability to love and to hold? And that's not the only job of the therapist, but I do think it's a very important one. Is that some kind of answer? A response, not answer.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Perhaps you could elaborate a little bit more about how the transference might be a burden to the treatment as well.
Well, it's a
If
burden to the therapist, which therefore makes it a burden to the treatment. If I engage in the dance of transference in the classic way, I'm constrained by it. It's a version of myself that um, I don't have to necessarily agree with, but I'm constrained by. I can't get free from it. So I'm not able to bring my own full self into the room. And of course, a lot of psychoanalytic approaches would argue that that's not what I'm there for. But also, when you look at the work of the great exemplars of psychoanalysis, you see that they are bringing their full self into the room. Starting with Freud, who, when he realized the client hadn't eaten all day, invited him to dinner. And with another client, beat the back of the couch with his fists and said, "You think I'm too old for you to love?" I mean, I don't know if you've read. There's a book of accounts of therapy with Freud by clients of Freud. It's a fascinating book, and it gives you a very different picture of what was going on from his case history.
It's very interesting. These things that we consider sort of unusual interventions,
Mm.
uh, being ubiquitous almost.
Mm.
My
Yeah.
my supervisor is Jim O'Neill, and he writes about his book He writes in his book Undressing about the whole treatment leading towards not quite a crescendo, but certainly like a big moment where the client wanted to be naked in front of him in the room
Mm.
and everything that sort of meant. And of course,
Mm.
nobody's making a technique out of that, but it's an
Not
interesting.
yet, anyway.
Yeah.
And Brian Thorne wrote a well-known paper about being naked with the client, right? Both people being naked. He could get away with it because he was a deacon of the Church of England. But it got him in trouble. He got him in trouble when he got transgressive in other ways. When he started arguing against the regulation of psychotherapy, they dredged up that old paper to discredit him.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I mean, that's the thing, isn't it? There's the story. There's the official story of what therapy is, which increasingly fools quite a lot of therapists. It fools quite a lot of trainees. They think that that's what they're supposed to be. They've got the Ten Commandments on the wall, and they abide by them. And then there's the reality of what happens, which is so much more interesting and exciting and messy and transgressive, and radical, in fact. Because I do still see therapy as intrinsically opposed to patriarchy and to capitalism, despite all the evidence that it isn't necessarily so.
Yeah, I think in reading Wild Therapy, I was struck by how, while it is definitely, theoretically grounded, it's a sort of very unpretentious approach, which you can, sort of compare to some of the more highfalutin, secondary literature, in contemporary schools. And that it would seem that sort of bridging the gap between theory and practice, which is such a large part of these trainings, uh, becomes impossible when people are writing and talking about something that they're not doing.
Yeah,
um, something completely abstracted.
yeah,
Uh,
absolutely.
mm, mm, yeah. Has anybody else got a question?
Yeah, I'd like to hear from other people as well.
Yeah. Thank you, Nick. Um, I mean, I was the kind of image that stayed with me is your description of kind of walking into a woodland and getting lost, and that in a sense kind of being the setting
Mm,
for something to happen, um, and the aliveness of a woodland and the aliveness of a tree. And it reminds me a lot of, I'm reading a book by Robert Macfarlane at the moment.
mm,
Is the River Alive? Which takes it's a different point of view, more kind of legal rights of forests and rivers and things like that. But and then the thought that stayed with me is that there's three of you then. There's
yeah,
you, the patient as such, we understand, and the woodland.
yeah,
And
which is in fact a
it,
community. So there's a lot more than three if you really go
yeah,
into it.
yeah. And then kind of, within that setting, you know, you, what you consider kind of your role, to be there, because there's a sense of openness and awe that somebody can feel sometimes, on their own, or what are you keeping yourself open to in those settings? um yeah, I think that's what I was wondering.
Yeah,
It's because you're not taking on someone on a look at this, the
yeah,
barks and look at this huge oak and something. It's not that. It's obviously something else, but then what kind of is it?
yeah. It's a companion role, I think, essentially.
Right.
In fact, it's like being a psychedelic companion, I think. Um, you're
Hmm.
both you're both in the experience and holding a part of yourself, a little bit outside it, holding a part of yourself in reserve, um, on behalf of the client. Um, Commenting often, I'd comment um, on what feels like a response of the woodlands to what's being said.
Hmm.
Um, if somebody speaks and immediately a jay starts calling. Okay, so something important's been said.
Right.
And it's using that amplification that 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 the other human offers. Often,
Hmm.
often we'd go out with a person holding a question in mind and looking for some kind of response from the other human world. So a medicine journey, in effect.
Yeah. And you said you're holding something back. um
I
what
mean,
would
in the
that
sense that I am in the role of helper.
Yeah.
I'm not simply there to have the experience.
Yes.
I'm there to help somebody else have the experience. So I'm in, and I'm not quite as far in. Which I actually think is a
Yeah.
good way of being in the room as well, in the
Yeah.
therapy room.
In a sense, it feels like you're, sorry for jumping in.
Yeah, sure.
It feels like, you know, you're in the therapy room, in a sense, you're open perhaps just to what, you know, for us, for maybe as a you're open to the speech of the patient. And here in a woodland, you're open to both the speech of the patient and the speech of the of nature, of the woodland around you as well.
Yeah. I mean, by my very simple model of therapy, in words of one syllable, is that whatever needs to happen for somebody is trying to happen as
Right.
best it can. And what the job of the therapist and the client is to notice what's trying to happen, often around the edges, and often in the margins of everybody's experience. It can be happening in the client, it can be happening in their unconscious use of language. It can be happening in my unconscious use of language. It can be happening inside me entirely. It can be happening as a physical symptom in either body. It can be happening outside the window. I had a client once who we realized after a while that every time she consciously held something back in the therapy, a car alarm would go on off in the street outside. It became a really reliable thing, you know. A car alarm would go off, and I'd say, "Okay, what was that you weren't saying?" And I think you can see how psychedelics has influenced that way of doing therapy, that way of thinking about it, and that way of carrying it out.
Yeah.
That just reminds me of I studied Tibetan Buddhism for a long time, and we were just talking about the shaman aspect. And I remember one of the teachers saying, you know, they would base what was going to happen on how many birds flew past, or, you know, it's just this lost art, this lost craft that sounds like is being renewed with the psychedelics.
Yeah,
the shaman
right
way.
Yeah.
Yeah, just to add, I was going to say I just had so many images of, you know, shamans practicing this kind of work in you know, in Peru or in the jungle, and you know, this isn't new. This has been going on for centuries, including you spoke about the sky and the information that you can see. That's part of the sort of cult shamanism, is about reading the sky and predicting all sorts of events. And there is a link, and I think it reminds me, it's kind of, we're kind of going towards a cultural difference conversation here, because I think some of our sort of clinical training is quite westernized and clinical, and therefore in some ways the environment is separated from anything outside of that. And I think you're kind of pointing to the importance of the expansion of the set and setting and your environment, and how one can get separated from themselves as well, but there's more of a connection in nature. This is nothing new, and I think it's really, and it just kind of, you know, links to how it's really important to go back to indigenous roots and tribes, and because there's so much information there as well, and there's such a powerful link.
And very important as well to get out of the colonial mindset in any way one can. You know, a great number of people talk about using nature for our healing, which is colonialism, pure and simple. You know, it's the idea that the rest of the world is there to be used by human beings is absolutely counter to anything that I believe. So yes, I completely agree with you. I don't know if any of you are familiar with new materialism, which is a sort of, I suppose, philosophical, in a sense, approach, which I'm finding enormously helpful. And one of the things it does, in line with what you were saying, is it goes back to animism. It says, yes, animism is the best description of the world and our relationship to it that we have. So it's a very sophisticated, a very postmodern version of a very ancient and universal understanding that the whole world is alive, that the whole world is interconnected, and that the world is co-created by everything that is in it.
Is new materialism, is it theorists like Isabel Stengers? And
Yes.
yeah,
Yes.
okay,
Yes.
yeah, she's very interesting. I've been reading her book.
Donna Haraway as well is one of my favorite people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Could you tell us something about your experience of regulation of therapies?
Ah.
And
Yes.
whether you think anything changes when drugs are involved? Um, like you said, at the moment we have these models, perhaps, in the Amazon or different places where you have group work with people laid on the mattress together, or round in a circle. But then you also have these individual treatment rooms where you have one therapist and one patient and two therapists, and similar models like that. But of course, in reading your work, I'm very intrigued about sort of taking people outside. It seems right, and for me. So just, yeah, something about those thoughts together and regulation.
Yeah. It's a huge issue. I mean, it's something that I've been fighting around ever since I started out as a psychotherapist. But when I did that, back when dinosaurs ruled the earth, UKCP hadn't yet been made. It didn't exist. We just got on with it. We just did what seemed a good idea to us. When UKCP was being formed, we took a look at it and decided we didn't like it much, and never got involved. And I've never been a member of UKCP or BACP. And in some bizarre way, nonetheless, I'm treated as credible. But the great majority of people who don't follow those lines are not treated as credible, of course. And I've seen the tentacles spreading and spreading over the decades, and it's how I feel about them. I don't mean the good tentacles that Donna Haraway talks about, but the tentacles of control and normalization. The mental health was a term which we thought we'd managed to abolish back in the 70s. It virtually stopped being used, a lot under the influence of Adi Lang and his friends. And boy, has it come back with a vengeance. And the whole idea of mental health, of course, introduces an idea of illness and of cure, and fixing people, which walks hand in hand with the idea of regulation. Because if you see the therapist's job as fixing people, then obviously you have to make sure that they fix people right. There was a big drive towards regulation. Well, there've been about 3 waves. I'm very interested in the fact, this is a sidebar, I'm really interested in the fact that psychotherapy knows so little of its own history. I'm very historically minded, and I've always looked at the story of psychotherapy, but actually considering the work we do and how much it's involved with our clients' history, it's very striking that most of us don't actually know much about what has happened in the 100 years or so of psychotherapy. We might know a few high spots, but there's a hell of a lot missing. So yes, one of the bits of history is that there have been 3 or 4 waves in this country already of attempts to regulate psychotherapy, to make it into something which is legally controlled. And they've all failed, one after the other. The most recent one was in the early 90s, and I was very strongly involved in that. And it failed basically because we made enough noise that the government said, look, if therapists don't want to be regulated, we're not going to regulate them. Because there was tremendous amount of resistance. I have a terrible feeling that another wave is building and that there won't be that resistance this time. Because I think the idea regulation has spread across the whole of our culture to a much greater extent than the idea of monitoring, the idea of the panoptic gaze of control is far stronger. And I think a lot of therapists emerged from training already convinced that their job is to fix and that there are right ways and wrong ways of doing it. And I think, quite honestly, I think that a lot of therapy organizations are training people who they shouldn't really train because they need bums on seats. And on some level, they know that. And so in order to try to stop those people actually causing harm, they give them very simplistic sets of rules. Thou shalt and thou shalt not. Just as a damage limitation technique. So yeah, you will have gathered from what I'm saying that I have absolutely no time at all for the idea of regulation. And I actually think it's a mistake, and I'm fairly sure you won't agree with me from what I know about what you do, but I think it's a mistake to try to convince people that psychedelics are compatible with normal life, are compatible with approved ways of being under late capitalism, because I don't think they are. As I said earlier, I think it's trying to square the circle. And I can see the reasons for it, because you're trying to legalize the damn things. But at the price of acting in a way that is legalizable. And I think it's quite a heavy price to pay.
Absolutely. Of course, some people talk about the idea of medicalization as that kind of Trojan horse. And, there is that element to things of, well, just because the psychedelics or any other drug are illegal doesn't mean people don't have access. There are
far from it,
yeah.
I mean, I think it is a Trojan horse, but the question is who's inside the horse and who's outside it.
Nick, can I just ask, you said that there was a wave in the 90s of therapists resisting regulation. Was there at least, if not on a sort of like official governmental whatever level regulation, was there not some sort of like a grassroots regulatory system amongst yourselves in the community? Because would you not agree that there must be some level of regulation within the field for sort of safety, not just on behalf of the people that you're working with, but also as professionals? Was there some sort of I don't know, like more of a cooperative, structural, community level regulatory system?
Well, it's interesting you asked that, because I was very much involved in starting one. We realized in the 90s that in order to oppose regulation through bodies like BACP and UKCP, we needed to offer some alternative. So we started an organization called the Independent Practitioners Network, which was basically a horizontal peer-based form of accreditation. People got together in groups of between 5 and 10. Each group worked out a way to stand by each other's work. In other words, asking ourselves, what do I need from other people in order for me to be able to say I stand by their work? And each group did it in a somewhat different way. It usually involved quite a lot of peer supervision, but it could involve a lot of other things as well. And then each group had to be validated by 2 other groups who said, yes, they have got a method of assessing each other's work, and they are actually carrying it out. And all of these 3 groups would have a commitment to sorting out anything which went wrong in a client-therapist relationship, basically by a mediation process, by a conflict resolution process, not by the kind of adversarial process which is completely dominant in the system now. If only we'd had the internet working back then in the way it does now, we could have done this very easily. We could have really made it work. And it is possible that people will try and start something like this up again. At that point, it involved a lot of long journeys to meet with other groups, and it was just too much time work. So it never reached a large enough size to really lift off. But there were several hundred of us who were really quite committed to it, involved in it. It was a very powerful experience. It has a certain relationship to the past, I think.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah.
Because I do agree with you that we need to be accountable. I absolutely agree with that. And I prefer that to the idea of regulation. We don't need to be accountable to some body above us.
As a top-down level.
Yeah. It's a very interesting thing, isn't it? That therapy organizations never form themselves in line with what we know about human beings in groups. Instead, they pull down an off-the-shelf model which comes from accountants and architects, or a corporate model in the case of BACP. But in other cases, they're anybody talking about, well, what's the healthiest way that we know of organizing in groups?
It's a great question, Keeks, and a beautiful answer. And I'm just so delighted to hear that method. It feels like a transmission going forward. Just thank you for sharing. And thanks for the question, Keeks.
Yeah, it's definitely food for thought, for sure.
You'll be giving us ideas. We've got a little handful of future practitioners, right?
Good. I have been trying to generate some interest in this model in a few places. Actually, I think something might emerge from it.
Keep us in the loop.
Yeah, I will, for sure. We're about there, aren't we?
Yeah. Do you have any final thoughts or words of wisdom for us before we round up?
I don't think so. I just hope that this has been helpful and interesting. I know I've been free associating wildly, but that's appropriate enough, isn't it, really?
Yeah, really fantastic. I've loved it and found it fascinating.
Good. I've enjoyed it.
Perhaps you'd be open to coming back in the future.
Sure, yeah, absolutely.
Great. Thanks so much.
All
Lovely,
right.
lovely to meet
Bye-bye.
you, Nick.
Take
Lovely to
care.
meet you. Thank
You
you.
too.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.